Welcome, Amartya Sen. Thank you so much for being with us today and for helping us celebrate IDRC's 40th anniversary. For us, a happy event. As you probably remember, we really started in India in 1970. Our first president was David Hopper, who had spent so many years in India working on the economy and agriculture in particular. And so India has always had a very special place in IDRC, and it continues. And whenever we think of India, we think of you and a number of other Indian friends of IDRC who have provided us with a lot of support over the years. So thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for recollecting those days. I remember actually in the 70s, I was just arrived at Delhi School of Economics, and Dave Hopper was very helpful in helping us with some computer technology being installed at the Delhi School of Economics. That was my first contact with IDRC. But then, of course, since I knew him, we also talked about what else he should do. And I must say, IDRC has been such a glory of achievement.
Well,
it's wonderful that you are celebrating what it has done.
Well, thank you. And India has been very central to what we've been celebrating, including through a number of speakers who came to us this year, all of whom you would know. I'll just mention one of them, Romila Thapar, gave a fabulous talk, which is part of the series. So just as in my life, India plays a central role, so in IDRC's life, it has always played a very central role as well. Last time you were at IDRC headquarters, I think, was in 2006, when you were in Ottawa to discuss the Commission on the Social Determinants of Health. And I know you're still very much involved in health policy. And I wanted to ask you how you think that is faring. Is health getting the type of attention it needs, and is follow-up occurring?
Well, I would say, David, yes and no, in the sense that there's much greater recognition of the importance of doing things, importance of intervention, very broadly speaking, in the field of health. On the other hand, the achievements are still quite limited. I mean, even in a country like India, where there's a much greater recognition now than in the past about the importance of health as well as the social influences that determine good health. But I have to say that the achievements are still relatively limited. I mean, they're a lot better than it used to be, but it could be a lot better than it is now.
Is it because the benefits of health are spread over time and political timelines are shorter than that, or do you think there are other reasons?
Well, it depends. It varies. Every country has its own problem. I think in India it's very much connected with not coming to grips with the fact that in order to have both having basic health care for all and indeed having even a successful private sector, you need a basic public sector that functions.
Yes.
And India has got prematurely privatized at a very basic level. And I know of cases on the basis of the reports of the trust that I was able to set up on the basis of my Nobel money, the Pratichi Trust, which studies education delivery and health delivery, that in many cases in eastern India, to some extent in West Bengal, but even more in Jharkhand and areas there, that the combination of private medicine in the form of cookery and quackery is quite remarkable. You go to a doctor and he charges quite a bit to this very poor peasant family and gives very little of a diagnosis. I even know of a case where malaria has been treated with a saline injection, which to the best of medical knowledge doesn't do anything. But so I think you can't have a dependence of the private medicine in a way that India has moved radically. I mean, people used to grumble earlier every time it came in America that India is a socialist economy, which it of course never was. But even the little bit of the sense that the state has to do things with the private sector. I think that's weakened. Of course, the state is doing more things now because India is richer and the growth produces more public revenue, and that to some extent they are being used. So there is progress, but I think there has been a weakening of the recognition that the state has a role in delivering healthcare at the basic level, which countries, Europe, America, even the United States, not to mention Canada, recognize that level. Japan, South Korea, China, and of course Thailand too, where there's a kind of insurance covering everyone. I'm going to a meeting of the Thai Health Assembly in December, and they're very proud of the fact that they do cover everybody. The country has many other problems.
Yes.
So I think that recognition is lacking in the case of India. But, every country has its own problem.
Absolutely. Something you said sparked off something in my memory. In many organizations, economic policy and social policy are seen to be somehow not incompatible, but bound to be at war with each other, and that growth is the enemy of social equity and social equity is the enemy of growth. And so we had a lot of sterile conversations when I was young about whether private sector-oriented approach was inimical to decent social policy and vice versa. Do you think we've gotten over this tendency to place growth in opposition to social policy?
Well, I wish I could say that we have gotten over that. I don't think we have. I think it's, I feel very frustrated because I have taken a position which is pro-growth as well as pro-public intervention. Yes. And there's no conflict because high economic growth is very helpful for public revenue. People don't often recognize when a country is growing at 6, 7, 8, 9%, public revenue tends to grow from the Indian experience at 10, 11, yes. 12, 13%, much faster. So it generates a lot of revenue, and that's important to do. And that's a pro-growth argument. And yet, it's inadequate because you need to use that money for the delivery of healthcare and education. And if you look at India, I think even though the commitment has increased, the amount spent on education and health is still very deficient, yes. Especially basic education and basic healthcare. Still remains very much imprisoned in a kind of a mindset, thinking that there may be shortcuts, maybe the private doctors could provide enough support and so on, which I think is a mistake. So I think we need to avoid the twin fallacy of thinking that economic growth with industrial expansion must necessarily make equity worse. It need not. Depends on what you do with the public revenue. But also that you need a commitment to use the public revenue for that purpose, for social infrastructure, health infrastructure, educational infrastructure, not to mention physical infrastructure. I think it's that broader recognition which needs to be more fully appreciated than it does. So even though there have been progress, which I wouldn't deny, if you just look at figures like life expectancy, you can see that there is a lot to do, and it's not that difficult to do either. That's the frustrating thing.
Absolutely. Now, your great friend Mahbub al-Haq had a major impact on the international imagination about 20 years ago with the first Human Development Report. You were very much involved. The first Human Development Index, which really struck the public imagination at the time. People were eager for next year's Human Development Index to see how they were doing. And since then, you and some of the researchers you've worked with have contributed to refining that index. We had Helen Clark with us some weeks ago who was speaking about how the index was shifting slightly in its methodology this year. I wanted to ask you about the usefulness of indexes, But is there a point beyond which the multiplication of indexes and league tables we're seeing today could become noxious also?
Well, that's a very subtle question, the last one. I think indexes have a value in drawing attention to something in a kind of inescapable, dramatic way. And I think Mahbub al-Haq was right in thinking that we needed something like the Human Development Index when he was trying to persuade me to help him to do that. Indexes, and I went on saying that it's a very vulgar thing to do. How much reality can you capture in one number? You have to describe a reality. You can't answer the question by saying 137. That seems like a dumb answer. Well, he told me that indeed it's vulgar, but what we need is a index which is just as vulgar as GDP, but which is associated with human life. So there he was a visionary. But we have to go beyond the index, of course. And you're quite right that the simplicity of the Human Development Index, which was part of its success also originally, that has to be ultimately transcended. So what I think the UNDP is trying to do is not to gut the old Human Development Index, but to, first of all, refine its methodology, as well as provide supplementary indicators. Now, do these together produce a situation of such confusion that you can't find your way in the jungle of indicators? I don't think we have quite reached the point. My main danger is that there may be just one index which becomes to occupy such a big thing that it kind of eclipses everything else. That's to a great extent what GDP did. And Mahbub was very aware that even though Human Development Index was a better index than the GDP, it should not be allowed to crowd out everything else. And I think this is important when I read about indicators coming in, or indeed when I worked on it, along with Joe Stiglitz, Jean-Paul Fitoussi, and others, for Sarkozy, for the French. We were quite committed to have a number of indicators to deal with. I'm a little concerned when I read in the papers that the British want a happiness index. I hope they want it along with other indicators, which are also important. So in some ways, I'm a multiple index person. And I think for me, the real difficulty is the kind of dislocation of thought that comes in. If you just regard one thing, just imagine if you had only happiness index. You're not concerned whether people are ill or well, they're educated or not. You just want to go on measuring whether they're happy or not.
Absolutely.
Now, that might have pleased Jeremy Bentham. It certainly would not have pleased John Stuart Mill and a lot of others I can think of. So I think it's a question of balance. But the new work that has been done connected with the refining, because some of it was done with IDRC's support.
Yes, well,
very
we were very
support.
happy to be able to support that
Yeah,
work.
I think the group that Sabina Al-Khair leads in Oxford, and there were others from elsewhere who joined that work, like James Foster. But they have produced very interesting, very important work. You know, all these work need further improvement, there's no question. And I would regard that the present multidimensional indicator is a good first shot. I can, between you and me, and between Sabina and I can even point out a few ways in which it needs improvement. But that's always the case.
That's the glory of research. You end one phase of research and think of dozens of things you'd like to work on next arising
Right,
from.
because it's also, it's not a one-step perfection that you're looking for. You're looking for enhancement, improvement. And that's the way everything is true of technology.
Absolutely.
You don't get from no technology to the latest at one go, to go through the stages.
Indeed. I wanted to shift. You were talking just a moment ago about education as well as health, and quite significant strides have been made in primary education around the world. I think secondary education is often left with less support, But I notice, because we're in the business of supporting research, that the gap between the leading universities of the world and the run-of-the-mill universities of the world all over the place is growing rather than shrinking. What one might have hoped 30 or 40 years ago is that the gap would shrink and that we'd have top-class universities all over the world. And we have a few all over the world. You have championed the revival of Nalanda University in India with very strong support from across Asia. The idea of reviving something that was great, probably the greatest of its time. And I wanted to ask you about that. What motivated you to...
Well, I was always very fascinated by Nalanda, even as a child. I went there in my pre-teen years, actually, first. Very impressed with this. This is a 5th century university, and it was destroyed in the 12th century, just the same time when Oxford University was being founded.
Yes.
So it had a very remarkable career, at its peak having 10,000 students, residential too, drawing from not only India but also China. The largest group other than Indians were the Chinese and the Koreans and Thais and Japanese. It's an entire Buddhist world network was connected with it. It was, and also to its glory, it was while it was a Buddhist foundation, it also did maths and astronomy, it did medicine, public health care. Many of the Chinese came there for maths and medical care and public health. And indeed, it's Yi Jin in the 7th century who produces the first, who was a student there for 10 years, produces the first comparative study of medicine in different countries and public health care, China and India. Comes down with a rather judicious final conclusion, I think, namely that in many respects, even though there are achievements in both countries, China overall probably dominated India in medical sciences, whereas India at that time dominated China in public health delivery. Now, given the problem that India has today with public health very well today, I mean, it's a little difficult to imagine that, but evidently that seemed to have been the case. And several of the Chinese authors, other than Yi Jin too, including Yuan Zhang, but also Fahian in the early 5th century, they were very involved in that thing. But one reason for the revival of Nalanda is not only that would be an unusual university, but it would be also something which would indicate a kind of Asian cooperation.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's among the very enthusiastic sponsors of it has been Singapore, particularly I should mention the foreign minister, George Yeo, who has played a very leading part in that. And the Singaporeans are very keen that China and India collaborate because they're stuck in between.
Indeed. And also they're the two components of Singapore itself, really.
That's right,
with some Malay contributions.
Yeah, there's one of two of the three components of that. No, I think it's a very exciting project. But, you know, since I chair the governing body at the moment, to revive a university after an 800-year hiatus is not an easy task to do. So we had to start from the ground. We have acquiring land, setting up buildings, planning the faculties. And like Nalanda in his old time, it would be contemporary, which of course today would mean that we'll have information technology, management and development, in addition to linguistics, religious studies, Sanskrit, and literature, Asian history.
Well, I think it's a project very widely welcomed, not just in Asia and elsewhere, partly because it gives the lie to the argument one sometimes hears more implicitly than explicitly that higher education is a luxury issue, that while you still have poverty, you shouldn't be focusing on higher education. At most, you should be focusing, and you should focus a lot on primary and perhaps a bit secondary. And I've always felt that actually higher education is a necessary, not an optional component for large developing countries?
Well, I absolutely agree. It's necessary in three different ways. It's first of all, you need higher educational outputs to run the primary educational arrangements well.
Yes.
Secondly, you need to inspire the best students to go on to do something
Yes.
other than multiplication tables. And therefore, the higher education is always a big incentive. And third, to take a broad view of relation of education to human life is very necessary, even for successful school education.
Absolutely. I think in a meaningful society, higher education has to be more than traveling to the US or Britain or some other country
Sure.
to get some of it before going home. So I, for one, am so pleased to see this project on the verge of takeoff in India, and also in some other countries, belatedly, including China, higher education, including quite a bit of curiosity-based research, finally taking off as well. I wanted to ask you as well about agriculture and agricultural research. As you know, you have been tremendously supportive in your own country of the importance of it. India made a great leap forward in the 60s, 70s.
The Green Revolution period.
The Green Revolution was a big success in India, although it carried hidden costs, which have become more obvious since in terms of water use and toxic fertilizers when used too much. Do you think India now, and countries like it, China also, can intensify agricultural productivity while tending at the same time to more sustainability than they did in the past?
I think so, because, I think the sustainability issue is important for the future, but also to guide thinking at the present time, because you can't suddenly you can't go on doing things in a way that would threaten the future and then say, now we turn sustainable. I mean, you have to integrate the two things. But, that has been a concern right from the beginning. Even if you think about the leaders of the Indian Green Revolution,
Absolutely.
like M.S. Swaminathan.
Yes, who was with us recently.
Yeah, and he has been very aware of the sustainability issue. So I think I certainly don't want the sustainability rhetoric to overwhelm the need for increased productivity and increased production. At the same time, I don't want the focus on production to crowd out the need for sustainability, both of agriculture itself, but also of human life.
Absolutely.
Particularly, you mentioned water. There's some areas the problem is very serious indeed, with the water table going down and so on. So it's a question of being able to solve the problem a lot better by thinking about it rather than just crowding, just walking in an uncertain way.
A country like Canada believes it has a great deal of fresh water, actually has less of it than it thinks, and wastes a great deal of it. India has a tremendous amount of water. The problem is managing the water, it seems to me, rather than the absolute availability of water. So it's something industrialized countries and developing countries share. How does one develop a mentality of managing resources in sustainable ways, a global problem? I'd like to ask you about innovation and science and technology. You've been a godfather to so much of it in your country and more widely. The outside world has been tremendously taken with the image of Indians all over the country grasping a cell phone, in touch with their cousins at the other end of the country, or getting the latest quote for pulse prices from some market town nearby. I wanted to ask you if there are innovations and technological breakthroughs that you've seen at work or you're aware of, or you think we should be focusing on that will be important to the development process.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm really as knowledgeable as I should be on this. What I do know is that there is a big task there, and which is an identifiable task. You're absolutely right, David, to point out that on one side we have the danger of huge monsoons, tremendous flooding. Pakistan had it in a bigger way,
Yes.
but India too has it. And then there are areas of drought and problems coming in the same area. You may have flood in one time and drought in another period. So I think it's a question of real departure in scientific and engineering management of water. It requires thinking in terms of preservation of the water when you have a tremendous amount, rather than trying to see how to get rid of it. And at the same time, trying to marshal the water resources in a period when you don't have the weather coming in a big way in that. There are also issues about what can be done about the water tablet and even if the excessive monsoon rains cannot be stored in a way that it could be preserved for immediate use as water. I don't know. I expect that there must be some technique of using that in order to deal with the water underground by releasing it in an appropriate way. There is a kind of infrastructural network needed in water management. And I don't think the problem has been engaged in India yet. And obviously it's not been engaged in Pakistan. And we have to really think a great deal about it. And the problem applies to Bangladesh too, which is suffering greatly from the arsenic issues, for one thing.
Yes.
But it is a country of totally excessive amount of water.
Indeed.
Every time, and I remember all my childhood, since I come from Dhaka, spending the whole of the vacation in boats to be able to get to our country home.
Yes.
And, the water everywhere.
Absolutely.
And to think that there the water level has fallen so much that the arsenic problem has become so extreme. It's really, there is something, there has to be a technological way of turning a page on this dilemma.
I'm, to conclude, Amartya, very struck in my own country, which is in some ways a postmodern country with all of the problems that brings, that we're having trouble today dealing with trade-offs in policy. Where do government revenues belong in terms of investments? Some simply goes into welfare and needs to. But there's a roughly finite amount of money available for investments. Health has tended to win out in Canada in recent decades. There have been big reinvestments in research in the past 10 years, but the previous 20 years weren't good for education or research. Infrastructure is beginning to break down in some ways in Canada, and we're a very rich country relative to many others. How can developing countries address the problem of trade-offs? Often developing countries with very limited revenues coming in. What matters most, and how does one convince those politically in charge that there are responsible ways of spending limited public funds and less responsible ways of doing so?
Yes, of course, a profoundly difficult question. I'm a great believer in the importance and reach of public reasoning. Because, I think any of these problems, David, we can't know the solution straight away, because that requires thinking, exchanging views, it requires research at one level, may require public exchange of approaches as to how we might go about doing it. And since I have been, even in my last book on the theory of justice, arguing why public reasoning is central to justice, and I think public reasoning is central to solving any of these problems, whether it is how to deal with excessive water in India in one season and lack of water in another, or dealing with Canada, the combination of extraordinary wealth as well as extraordinary levels of prosperity, with doing things appropriately.
Yes.
I don't begrudge the fact that Canadians have such wonderful health care, but as you know, one has to think also about the other priorities,
Absolutely.
education, research, and so on, for the long run as well as for the immediate future. I've always been very doubtful about having ready-made slogans in answer to any problem. One of my teachers, Pierre Sharpa, in Cambridge, in Trinity College, used to say the real trouble with Cambridge economics, as he saw it, was that no one here rests until a theory had been converted into a slogan. So I think I'm very afraid of slogans as such. You have to think about how to reason your way through. And I also believe that identifying the problems is halfway towards solving them, because it allows us to think about it. And once we know what the problems are with clarity, then I think we can face it. I mean, if I may come back to what we were discussing earlier in India, the fact that premature privatization at a very basic level is such a problem in Indian medicine, that recognition has to be much greater. Once that is recognized, there are different ways of solving it.
Yes.
And even with India's lack of munificence compared with Canada, we can do it. But we have to understand the problem clearly. I think the same must apply in Canada. I wouldn't be pretentious enough to try to suggest in which line to think, but I would certainly, as somebody who enjoys going to Canada and who has so many Canadian friends, look forward to hearing what's going on.
Well, we'll see about that. I wanted to thank you today. You were talking just now about public reasoning and the importance of it. You've done so much to induce public reasoning on a variety of issues over the last 40, 45 years. And it has mattered globally. It has mattered way beyond the borders of India. But in India, I've admired the support you've given to civil society. Civil society has been able to capture the attention of politicians at times and has been able to force onto the table issues that politicians all over the world would prefer not to deal with.
Yeah.
And I think the encouragement you've given them, so often I've seen you give them, your participation in their efforts has made a huge difference in your own country, and I think is admired everywhere.
Oh, that's terribly kind of you to say that. Thank you very much.
Amartya, thank you very much for being with us on this happy occasion for IDRC.
Yes, it is a wonderful occasion.
Thank you.